In fly fishing with a spinning rod, it is important to use proper casting technique. I'm going to tell you how to do this. It's not too difficult. You don't need to be, believe me, it's a lot easier than casting a fly rod. First of all, because you've got your lure and then you've got maybe a couple feet of flies behind it, I recommend don't bring your rod back and cast over your head. The reason why, it's very simple. With all those flies dangling behind your lure, you could hook yourself in the back of the head. And if you've got a bead-head fly, that can feel like getting shot in the back of the head with a BB gun. It doesn't feel good. Take my word for it. I know. What you should do is bring your rod back either to your left side, and then you cast forward, or you cast from your right side, however you want to do it. Left side or right side, just do that cast. Cast at a 45-degree angle, keeping the rod kind of away from your body so you don't get hooked by it. And when you cast forward, usually most people, they cast at about a 45-degree angle. 45-degree angle gives you your maximum casting distance. Before you bring your rod back, take a brief look at your lure. If your lure is kind of twirling back and forth, spinning on its axis like this, if it's doing that just before your cast, and chances are, when you make your cast, your lure is going to keep twirling during the cast, going through the air, and it's going to wrap your fly leader line around the main line. That's not good. You don't want that to happen. So before you make your cast, just pause a moment and make sure that this lure is behaving itself and not curling too much. When you bring your rod back, there's a certain way of doing it, a certain rhythm. Imagine the flies dangling from your lure. If they're just hanging straight down from your lure, vertical, then you suddenly move them very fast at a 45-degree angle. Just think about that. Okay, so they're being pulled at a 45-degree angle very fast when before they were at a vertical angle. This is going to cause them to tilt. It's going to give them angular momentum. And so now it's like you've got a giant propeller spinning in the air during the cast. When this happens, you've got the chance for line twists, you've got the chance for tangles. So what you need to do is to get your fly line, your leader line, aligned with the direction that you're going to be casting in. You bring your rod back in such a manner that when you pause it, just before you go forward, the fly line is going to swing up at a 45-degree angle, pointing in the direction that you're about to cast to. This way, when you move your rod forward, the flies move straight, like an arrow. Let me show you a video of this. If you're casting from your left-hand side, you're going to want the flies to fly through the air to the left of the lure and slightly behind. If you're casting from your right-hand side, you're going to want your flies to fly to the right of the lure and slightly behind. And if you follow this method of swinging the flies back so that they are at about a 45-degree angle just before the cast happens, then you're going to get this effect. The lure will go in one direction, the flies will behave themselves, and they'll be flying to the side, slightly behind. And you're going to get very, very few tangles, very few line twists when doing this. Just before your line hits the water, your lure hits the water, I recommend that you grab the line gently and slow down the line so that the lure hits the water first, and then the two flies will go beyond it and land in the water beyond the lure. So it's like you've got you, the line, the lure, and then the two flies beyond it. It's very important for dry flies. It helps to put the flies into a quiet zone where they can go and start feeding on it, without being too bothered by the lure. Although in reality, these little crankbaits, they don't bother the fish very much. They usually cause some attraction to the fish, but it's still, in my experience, if you have usually about 2 feet of distance between your crankbait and your fly, that seems to help. It seems to improve the strikes that you get on it. And you want to start getting that distance immediately. As soon as they land on the water, you can do that by grabbing the line very gently and bringing that line to a break just before your lure hits the water. If you're fishing nymphs or wet flies, there can be some pros and cons to doing this. Just think, if you're fishing nymphs, you're trying to get them to sink deep. If you cast the nymphs out so that they land beyond the lure, then they kind of have to sink back below the lure in order to get deep. And the lure might be going downstream, so it's like they're doing a little catch-up. If you let the nymphs hit the water first, and then the lure lands beyond the nymphs, it's going to be a little easier for those nymphs to start sinking right away. This is a little similar to what they call the tuck cast if you're doing a fly rod cast with an actual fly rod. You want to give those nymphs a chance to start sinking as soon as possible. It's really the total opposite of fishing a dry fly, in which you want those flies to be beyond the lure. For nymphs, usually you want them to actually land before the lure and start sinking, while the lure then starts drifting over them and then slowly back towards you, assuming you're fishing a stream and you're casting in an upstream manner. But, I myself, I usually just out of habit always grab that line, get everything laid out in a straight line, and I still catch plenty of fish. And I get very few tangles. Usually the flies have less weight and they've got a certain amount of air resistance, and so they will travel behind the lure. The lure has got the mass, so the lure has the momentum to go through the air. The air resistance doesn't impact the lure as much as it does the flies, so usually the lure is going to fly forward ahead of the flies. But suppose you're fishing a couple flies, let's say a big woolly bugger and a big fuzzy zonker. These flies, when they get wet, they have more mass to them, and it is possible sometimes when you cast those two big wet flies, they'll have enough mass that they can actually cut through that air resistance and overtake your crankbait or whatever lure you're using. When that happens, possibility for some tangles, possibility for some line twist. So I don't fish two big wet flies together at the same time. I'll have my first fly be the big fat fuzzy wet fly, maybe a big woolly bugger or something, and then my second fly is going to be a small fly, maybe a number 12 soft hackle, for example. That second fly, acts like a tiny little parachute. Helps to slow down my first fly a little bit so that the whole fly rig stays behind the lure, does not overtake it, decreases the chance of it getting tangled with the lure. Same thing for nymphs. If you're fishing nymphs, don't put two big heavy copper john nymphs on your line. Maybe have one copper john nymph be your first nymph, and then the next nymph, the second nymph, would be something small. If it's got a bead head on it, if you need to put a bead head to get it down a little deeper, let it be a small nymph, let's say number 16, for example. And then you'll see that you can fish nymphs all day long and not get a tangle. You don't need to have a degree in physics as I do to learn how to cast properly. It's pretty simple. If you're having a problem, pay attention, think about it, and usually you can figure it out. Typically, the only times that I get tangles when I fish is if I get a snag. I'm pulling really hard and everything comes snapping back at me. Sometimes I get a tangle from that. If I catch a fish and it slips out of my hands and it's flopping on the ground everywhere, sometimes I get a little bit of a tangle. If I'm catching a lot of fish, I've got two flies and they're getting tangled sometimes after I'm trying to release the fish, I might cut one of the flies off. But if I'm catching half the fish on one fly and half of the other fish on the other fly, I'd be real tempted to keep both of those flies, because I would guess they're probably helping to increase the number of fish I catch. It's a matter of opinion. It depends on whatever situation you're in.